Will you put? Oh yeah, okay. Now, can I
think I need some.
move through my own slides, please?
Second of May, okay. Oh, I think we need to move.
The presentation.
Right. Well, this is just a quick summing up. The title of what we've chosen for our webinar this week is part 1, and next week at the same time is part 2. So we'll move on, please. And welcome to everyone. Some people and some friends I know already, and others I am pleased to meet for the first time maybe. And the sponsors, as you know, I think from the stuff you've had sent to you, are Church and Peace, which I'm going to ask Lydia to say a few words about in a moment. Co-operative Alternatives, thanks to my good friend and helpmate in all this, Tiziana, and Belfast City Council, which is something of a mystery, but we'll leave it at that for the moment. And we have with us here 4 speakers who are contributors really. Lydia, General Secretary of Church and Peace, based in Germany, but with a fair amount of coverage in Europe. Rosie, who's going to be speaking on behalf of the Just Money movement. Tiziana, the Zoom host and my support and advisor throughout the planning of this event, for which I'm very grateful. And Bridget, who is going to offer a contribution on mutual banking in this session. So, Lydia, would you care to say a few words to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello and good evening, everyone. I know some of you. I'm happy to see you all. As Tony mentioned, I'm General Secretary of Church and Peace, which is a European-wide ecumenical network. And I'm based in Germany, but the association has over 100 member organizations, churches, peace groups, but also individuals in 14 European countries. Tony is serving as one of our board members, and I'm very happy that he gave the idea and impetus to explore this topic of ethics and banking today. The members of Church and Peace are inspired by the Gospel's message of nonviolence and peace in a very holistic perspective. So this message inspires their theology, but also their practice in church, in society, and in their individual lives. This means saying no to structures of violence in private, social, and intergovernmental relations, but also saying a loud yes to alternatives that are already being lived out in many places. And also the members walk the talk, so they take concrete steps towards building a just, sustainable, and peaceful future. These steps are as broad as the membership and broad and geographical, but also themes. So this can be opposition to militarism and arms export in the UK, for example, the Christian campaign against nuclear weapons, or further developing the concept of civil resistance as a way of non-violently defending values and the common good against an aggression from outside or inside. Other themes are interfaith dialogue in the Balkan countries, or trainings in environmental peace building, or theological work, for example, on the link of sustainability and economic structures and what tasks this field poses for churches and Christians. So as an association, Church and Peace stands as a mosaic of peace church witness in different European contexts. It serves as a meeting place and a platform for dialogue and encouragement, spiritual renewal and orientation. And it participates in dialogue with churches and other ecumenical bodies. It offers a peace church voice to public discussions. And it offers a space for reflection, gives ideas, and exchange about peace theology, peace building, and peace practice. So today's and next week's theme, banking and ethics, is, in my opinion, an important lever where individuals as well as institutions or churches can and should put the call to a holistic peace and a sustainable and just future for all into action. So I'm excited to be here with you tonight and to learn from our speakers about those alternatives and to discuss why should we be concerned about the financial services we use.
Mhm. Good. Well, shall I take up the story then, please? Could you help me out with that? Share the screen. Well, we could move on, I think, now, please, to the next slide. We're not sure because we're not sure how long things will take, but I am keen to encourage questions and comments and suggestions. And I'm making two suggestions here. One is to use the chat function in Zoom, but if you wish instead, you can email me on the email address that I've given there. I'll come back to that possibly later if we need to remind ourselves of the email address. And if you could move on, please. This question of finance and the use of finance for good or for bad is a subject which has intrigued me for quite some time, I think. My first attempt in a public venue, I think, was an invitation that came from the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, a UK-based organisation, which is since is in fact the parent, and I'm sure Rosie will say more about this, of the Just Money movement. So why this theme? Because I think if we wish to tackle the problems of our time, we need to know the causes and as well as the consequences. And I think misuse of finance is a serious problem at the moment, and it's coming from fairly wealthy and sources which have a great deal of power and ability to put across the case and to keep the rest of the case and the work they're doing secret. So this has been an interesting challenge and an opportunity for me to see what can be said to make people feel a bit more aware about banking. This bit of the story is a melancholy bit, I'm afraid, and I'm looking forward to seeing Rosie because there is a more side which I think is much more impressive in terms of what is happening in the world of finance. But I thought I'd go through the bad stuff first, and then we'll see what we can do to pull ourselves out into a better frame of mind. Move on, please. Well, there is undoubtedly the case that most of us, our relationship with the world of finance is often and only sometimes with the idea of a personal bank account. And that brings me to a question which you all have your own answers for, I guess. How do we choose our bank? Is it by convenience? We happen to see a branch down the street from where we live, or some point we pass every day on our way to our other activities in life. So convenience might play a part. There might be family loyalty. But it's not often the case, in my experience anyway, where people ask the bank about ethical matters. I once had a student and I put this question to them about how did he imagine that banking and ethics went together. And to my amazement and surprise and pleasure, he went into his bank and said to the bank teller, we call them, I think, or used to do, does the bank have an ethical statement? And the person behind the counter really didn't know how to answer the question. So after a bit of thought, they said, well, if we make a mistake, we'll certainly do our best to restore it. But that seemed to be about the limit of the understanding of the word ethical. So let's move on and see what I think are the issues. The question I'm posing, I think, is, are there conflicts between banks and the common good? And that leaves me then with the task of defining the phrase common good. And I think about it for a while, and I decide that there are three closely linked concepts, I think, which define, they're mutually dependent, and they offer something each from their own perspective. Justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. And as a working definition then of the common good, I'm suggesting that activities which damage these concepts are running contrary to the common good. Activities which promote these ideals might, I say might, and I'll come back to that in a moment, be contributing to the common good. In other words, perhaps to strive for the common good is not just a matter of avoidance. It's a matter of doing something which bears upon the issues and problems of our time and seeks to be a positive contribution to their improvement or amelioration. I know we could discuss for hours and hours on end the definition of the common good, but I don't think this is the time to do it. So if we could move on, please, and see what happens next. There are known to be 4 big banks in the United Kingdom. There are more than that, but I think the big 4 are the ones that people are aware of in terms of their names. They get a certain amount of trust because of their size and the way they appear to conduct their business, and they've got plenty of money to advertise their services. And every country has banks which dominate the national economy, and many have also got global activities, just as the big 4 banks in the UK have. But in terms of the experience that I'm going to share and the insights and research I've been doing, I'm going to concentrate upon the big 4 in the United Kingdom, which sadly, I think 2 of them have a Quaker origins. I'm not going to say which the 2 are, but many of you present this evening, or virtually present this evening, may know who I'm referring to. And if you really want me to tell you, I might tell you at the end. But it does seem very sad to find something with a Quaker origin, which has now turned so badly in the wrong direction. And if you look beyond the United Kingdom, you find that there's really very little difference between the activities of the big banks in other countries and the ones that I'm going to discuss or present something about this evening. So could we move on, please? The first point that comes to my mind is that the threat of financial crises is still with us. The first, or the most recent one, I should say, was about 15 years ago. And we're still feeling the adverse consequences of that on the common good. Certainly in the United Kingdom, the government that politically took over soon after the end of the crisis, decided that austerity was a way of dealing with the financial problems that it had created. And austerity was really not the right answer by a long, 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 long way. And we're still stuck rather much, I think, with the austerity notion that we have to, quotes, to use the English language phrase, tighten our belts for some reason, but it wasn't obvious that much belt tightening went on in other directions. The last few months have shown, I think, that there is a bit of an unease about banking. They're recurring in various ways. Since March, I think we've been new signs of instability in the banking system. And 3 names that come to mind, I think, both of them in the United States, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and in Switzerland, Credit Suisse. But there's also been little wobbles reported in the financial press from some of the other large banks in other countries. And yet, I think the good news is, and I think Rosie's going to pick up this theme for us, there are banks whose work is committed to the needs of these times. And that is something to celebrate. But I'm hoping we can share that insight with Rosie. So next slide, please. I stumbled across this in the newsletter a few days ago, Social Europe, and the gist of it is that we still are there's some standoff between what is needed in the terms of regulation, what is described in the short extract I've given there of tough regulation. There's somewhat hesitation going on, and I think last time tougher regulation was proposed by the regulatory authorities in different countries, it really didn't bind as much as it should. And you may know in other countries, well, I'm sorry, I'm going ahead of myself there. The British government has been talking seriously about sort of loosening the regulations even further, and they use the word competition as being a good idea. But competition, I think, has its uses, but I don't think competition in banking just means one crowd get more wild than the other, and it ends in tears again. So it's still very much a topical issue in the times in which we're living. Now, if we could move on, please, I just illustrate the kind of things that I have in mind. I thought I would do a search on 3 or 4 activities, banking activities, which I see as threats to peace. And I'm interpreting the word peace as appropriate in terms of there's 2 other components which I think are important: social justice and the integrity of creation. I'm just using peace as a broad banner for those other possible meanings of the word peace. The ones I've chosen, and it didn't take much effort, I think, to find evidence that this is indeed the case, that banks are taking active. Financing the fossil fuel industry has become a huge game in the banking world, particularly the big banks. Activities that damage the environmental services, deforestation, development of harmful pesticides, for example. The arms trade, manufactures and trading of weaponry. The abuse of human rights, for example, the Alberta tar sands in Canada and the East African crude oil pipeline. The big 4 banks in many banks in other countries are all involved in these activities. I could have picked more activities which could cause, to put it mildly, unease. The level of directors' remuneration, for example. But I felt that this was enough to nail the case that big banking is somewhat out of control with respect to the potential that it has, and not just the potential, but the actuality of the work they're doing, which certainly runs contrary to the common good. So please, can we move on? Or at least skip that one, please. One might ask, if one was skeptical, well, how do you know about these activities? And the answer is there are wonderful archives of carefully researched documents on this issue. Banking on climate chaos, bankrolling extinction, the banking sector's role in biodiversity crisis. Banktrack, a body based in the Netherlands, but covers a wide diversity of banking activities in different countries. And Pax for Peace, who deals, full title of their research is Largest European Banks and the Arms Traders. And one more, please, and other sources. The Ethical Consumer magazine, which has been published now in the United Kingdom since the late 80s, which I've had the pleasure of following since its foundation, and indeed I know several of the staff quite well. And this, I think, was one of the problems I had earlier this year, to pursue this theme as something which I felt comfortable about, and something which I think has a salience for the times we're living in. And on the right-hand side of the screen is the issue of the Ethical Consumer that came slipping through my postbox early in the new year, dated January and February, and it's a wonderful account in great detail of the good, the bad, and the ugly in the world of banking. And to my pleasure and surprise, I see they've gone a step further, and they brought out a second, 2 other versions, I think, but this is the third I've had. I hope you can see that all right. It's the Ethical Consumer for May and June 2023, and the main title is Seeing Through the Greenwash, What is Your Money Really Financing? Can I just be assured that what I'm holding up to the camera is visible enough to make the point? I'll take the answer as yes, and we'll move on, please. Questions which are rarely asked, I think, but again, I think need to be asked. What is banking for? Should it be a public service? And this is a quote from the writings and work of an organization called Positive Money. Positive Money has been going now, I think, for maybe 10, 15 years, probably arising out of the financial crisis of the years 2007, 2008. And it is seeking monetary reform. It's a difficult task because, apart from anything else, people think the idea of monetary or banking reform would be too complex for them to understand. But I think that's a mistake. I think there's a certain deliberate clouding of the waters when it comes to trying to understand what could be done and what needs to be done. And I've put that quote there just to emphasize the point that others are raising the same questions as we are ourselves this evening. And it brings in particular the question, should it be a public service? Many of the states of the United States have, in fact, pursuing the idea of a public banking service based upon the state governments. I have some reservations about the idea, but nevertheless, I think it's an idea which will be worth pursuing. And our friend and contributor this evening, Bridget Mahan, will pick up on the idea of not so much a public banking system as a mutual banking system. I think I'm close to the end of now of what I wish to say, but I feel I've made my point. It seems to me, to use scriptural metaphors, it's time for cleansing of the temple. That banking with ethical values does exist in spite of the rather bleak story I've put to you so far. More public awareness is required of what is available and the need for reform. Those two aspects, I think, go together, and hence the stress on the word and. And I'm now asking Rosie to pick up the story. But maybe we just have a little break. We're plenty of time for what we want to do. And if anyone wants to raise a comment, a question, or anything like that, I may be able to answer, or if not, we can rely on things put into chat. And I see I've got something in chat already. Will I also share slides by email afterwards? The answer is yes, I will, yeah. Any other questions, comments? You're all mute at the moment, so you need to be demuted, I think, if we're to hear something verbal from you. Tiziana, we all muted, except for me.
Yeah, they can unmute themselves, but what about...
mute yourself and you're not locked in. If
no.
you want to ask any questions or comments, yes.
We can hear maybe the story of Rosie and then come back to
Yes, maybe so. Okay. It's nice to get one's breath back, and it's nice to have a moment to reflect on what's been said. Thank you, Rosie, and I look forward to you coming in and tell us what we...
Thank you, Tony. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and thanks, Tony, for that really thought-provoking, comprehensive overview. I think that's a really good way into thinking about some of these issues, and you've presented, as you've said, some of the bad news, but hopefully we can also share some of the good news.
I know we can, yeah.
And with hearing from Bridget later. So I've long been interested in how we practice peace and justice in very practical ways in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
I worked with the student Christian movement for many years, and then for Christian Aid, and more recently I've been working with the Just Money movements. So I thought it might be helpful for me just to say briefly a little bit about who we are for those who don't know us. We've recently changed our name. As Tony hinted at, we were founded as ECCR, the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, over 30 years ago. And over those years in between, we've been bringing together individuals, churches, religious orders together to campaign on issues of corporate responsibility. So how businesses behave in the world and particularly how companies based here in the UK impact on communities in the global south. And we've had a role over those years since between becoming ECCR and then Just Money movements, in briefing church investors in their engagement with these companies, in being involved in networks like looking at nuclear weapons financing, and all kinds of different issues. And so we decided to rename ourselves as Just Money Movement to more, I think, gather up all the different threads of what we do. And we have this vision of a world where money is used to shape a fairer, greener future for everyone. And we do that through education, through campaigning, through trying to build a really strong and diverse movement across the churches in the UK to work towards that vision. And we have two particular programmes of work: Money Makes Change and Church Action for Tax Justice. And Money Makes Change is the piece of work that I'm involved with, which is around educating and equipping Christians about our own money choices and how these connect us to the global economy. So I was really glad to meet Tony and to hear about his concerns in these areas too. And I want to share a few ideas with you about how we might push for the kind of change we want to see in the banking system. But firstly, and I think Tony's done a great job of this already, so I won't go too much into this, but why should we be concerned with how banks operate? One of the exercises that I invite people to do when I run workshops is to think about their financial footprints, how their use of money impacts on the world. And people tend to focus on their spending and their giving, which is understandable because many of us have made decisions over the years to align our spending habits with the change that we want to see in the world, and we give to causes that we are concerned about. But people often miss their choice of bank, which I think underlines the importance of what we're talking about tonight. Our banking is very much part of our financial footprint. Vast sums of money are moving between bank accounts every single day. Banks use our money, they shape society in the here and now and in the years to come. And as Tony's indicated, banks are not all the same, but that might be a commonly held narrative. What future is our money shaping? So I just wanted to give a bit of an overview about what is the world that our money is currently shaping if we're banking through those big banks that Tony mentioned earlier. And I've just brought together some headlines, really. You know, we can thank campaigners and we can thank good investigative journalism for the rise in stories about banking and ethics in recent years. And I've just highlighted a few on this slide that have caught my eye. There are issues like greenwashing, there's deforestation, there's highlighting the bank's involvement in new fossil fuel projects, there's political lobbying, there's tax avoidance, and there's historic links to slavery. And that's probably just scratching the surface of the kinds of issues that we could be thinking about tonight. And I'd be interested, as the conversation continues this evening, to hear about the issues you're concerned about. So do feel free to add a comment in the Zoom chat. What are you most concerned about? What has brought you here? What was it about the topic that caught your eye? And if you want to, what would an alternative headline look like if the banking system acted for the common good? If you want to have a go at formulating in the chat an alternative headline that was a good news story, or based on something that you have seen or experienced locally, then please do add that in the chat, and it would be lovely to see that grow as the evening goes on. But why is there an urgency to take action? Why is this a really critical issue for us to be exploring tonight, but also for us to be sharing with others beyond this evening? There's an urgency, I think, of a need for a different financial system. And that urgency is beginning, I think, to take shape and beginning to be heard at a global level. I was really struck when I looked back to the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow, that there was a message coming out very strongly within the UK's hosting of the talks that banks needed to change. So this particular phrase was in the preparation for the talks. To achieve our climate goals, every company, every financial firm, every bank, insurer and investor will need to change. And I think particularly as we work through all our churches and networks and through other things that we're involved in, as we work towards achieving net zero, there's no room for carrying on business as usual. Banks can't continue to finance new fossil fuel projects which lead us towards climate disaster. So when we're thinking about our climate action, our action for peace, very much thinking about what our banks are doing with our money in terms of climate crisis is something that needs to be, I think, on all of our agendas. And then just zooming into a very particular issue that I'm doing some work on at the moment. One of the issues we're campaigning on at the moment is banks' financing of single-use plastic, which is in billions of dollars and continues to rise. So the way that banks are financing plastic producers looks like they're forecasting a future where plastic is going to be with us and plastic is going to increase. And we know that that is not a scenario that the world and biodiversity can cope with. The good news is that, and some of you will be aware of this, the UN member states have agreed to start negotiations on drawing up a global plastics treaty that would set rules for production, use and disposal of plastics. So how will banks respond to that? If you go to the source of the problem, the finance that enables plastic production to happen, it's clear that banks will need to act too. And we think, for any of the issues that you are concerned about, from the arms trade to nuclear weapons to deforestation, if you look at it very carefully, finance will be at the heart of both the problem and the solution. So what and who does banks decide to lend to and do business with? Those are really critical questions that we need to ask about any of the issues that we're currently campaigning on and interested in. And I also wanted to just highlight the links between banking and the cost of living crisis, which I know is very much of concern to all of us, and we're seeing the impact of it in our local communities. How banks operate and who they serve is about those very close to home issues too, around access to financial services, like particularly in the midst of the cost of living crisis. Millions of people do not have access to the financial services they need for day-to-day living. And I thought this particular quote from Fair for All Finance, who are working in the UK on these issues, was really worth highlighting. The impact of not being able to access fairer finance, having to choose between going without essentials or turning to high cost credit or illegal money lenders, has a huge impact on people's physical and mental health. It can start to spiral into long-term debt and limit people's ability to properly participate in society. So if we're thinking really holistically, the banking system impacts on every area of our lives and particularly on the most marginalised. So we need to act, and we need to act swiftly. So what can we do? And I've picked out a couple of things that we can do, firstly around educating ourselves and then taking action. So I'll just explore this idea of educating ourselves and being attentive as the first thing that we can do. All of us, wherever we are, can ask questions around our choice of bank. I'll just put a few examples there. I think the very first one to ask is, who owns the bank? How is it structured? Who's involved in the decision making and who profits from its activities? I think that can give us a good indication of the bank's values and ethics. And then this is something that Tony touched on, who is the bank involved with? Who is it making loans to? Who is it investing in? Who's it providing services to? And is it providing those services and that finance to sectors that have concerns around? And there'll be issues that you're particularly concerned about, and it's really worth asking that question. And what work does the bank do on financial inclusion? Does it serve or impact negatively on people who are marginalised and financially excluded? We can't always take what banks say at face value. So another question to ask is the bank involved in greenwash? Is it giving the impression it is doing more than it is around climate action? Banks are, I think, trying to get the market of people who are starting to ask questions around what their banks are involved with, and there's many sums of money being put into advertising that makes banks look greener than they are. So it's really worth just being very attentive and aware of that. And there are many other ethical concerns that you might ask of any business, but we can ask of banks as well. We can ask around tax avoidance, around executive pay, something that we're doing some work on at the moment at Just Money Movement is the ethnicity pay gap. So many banks have ethnicity pay gaps in terms of what they pay their employees, and we're asking them questions around what they are doing to address those pay gaps. Could also ask around issues like the living wage. So there's some examples of the kinds of questions that you could ask, and it might sound overwhelming, but there are organisations working in and campaigning in all of these areas, and the information is much more readily available than it used to be. Organisations like Ethical Consumer that Tony's mentioned have very useful guides to ethical banks based on the research that they undertake, and particularly Ethical Consumer, I know, in its guides to banks will look at all of these issues and rank them and give you a good sense of how the bank is making progress in any of these areas. And I thought this was worth sharing as well, because I think we can feel like that we are very disconnected from the financial system, and I think this is something that we, as a narrative, that we need to change. It doesn't have to be that way. People created the system, and people can change it. And I think one of the things that we need to start undoing in our communities is that narrative that it's something that we can't change, that it's somehow fixed. So that's just something that is more about how we talk about these issues and how we approach our conversations with others, that we point towards hopeful signs of a different way of banking. And then the second thing that I wanted to draw our attention to, once you've done your questioning and your researching, is ways to take action. So the first thing that you might choose to do if you are with one of the big banks is to engage with that bank, engage with them around changes in policy and practice. And your voice is louder if you join with others. So see if there is a current campaign going on that you can join in with, and start to challenge the status quo. There are some banks that have regular opportunities for customers to give feedback, but do take, if you want to, if you're not thinking about moving your money straight away from a bank, then take the power that you have as a customer to talk to them about the issues that you care about. Some people may have power also as shareholders, perhaps through your church institutions or as investors, and there are ways that you can take action there. I just wanted to give a very quick example of something that we're working on through our Don't Bank on Plastics campaign. We've been inviting our supporters to contact their bank about their bank's policies on single-use plastic producers and polluters and who they finance, and ask their banks to redirect finance to solutions to the global plastics crisis. And we've had some really good conversations between supporters and banks, a surprisingly good amount of feedback from banks who haven't got very much in their policies, but are saying that this is something that they are considering as part of their climate action. And next Friday, we are asking a question at HSBC's AGM, because HSBC is one of our target banks. So please do keep us in your prayers next Friday. I just wanted to give that as an example of something that you could get involved with. So yes, engage with your current bank, but you also might choose to move your money, to choose a purpose-driven, value-led bank. And I think we can see that as a form of economic activism, building the movement for stronger value-led banks, and moving our money and sort of putting our money where our heart and our values are. All of us are probably coming from different contexts, so I'm quite sort of nervous about saying particular banks, but one really good place to start is the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, which has lots of inspiring stories of banks around the world that are putting people and planet first, and you can search by country. So yeah, that's a great place to explore. Also, there's a growing movement of individuals and churches who are divesting from fossil fuels. Your churches and networks may well be involved in that divestment movement. And I think that has been a really good conversation starter for many people about their choice of bank as well. If they've discovered that their bank is involved in financing fossil fuel expansion, I think more and more people are looking to move money away and looking for a greener bank. And Bank Green is a really helpful tool that you can use. You can put your bank into them. It's an online tool. They'll tell you if your bank is on their system, they'll tell you what your bank's fossil fuel policies are, and it will give you examples of banks that you could switch to. Moving your money is quite a simple thing to do if you're an individual. There are some things which take a bit more time and effort, but I really think are worth being involved with because they're more about changing the system and about those structural changes that we need to happen. So campaigning for legislative change is something that I would urge you to do if there's something that you can join in with. In the UK, there's a coalition coming together around the Fair Banking Act. If you're interested in that, then get in touch and I can keep you in the loop with that. And talk to your elected representatives about your concerns. So, you know, make sure that they are hearing that fair and green banking is something that you care about. Build relationships with them, send them information, send them briefings. You don't need to be an expert in this area, but this is something that might not be on their radar and you can bring it to their attention. And lastly, champion the change that you want to see. I really liked what Lydia said at the beginning about saying yes to alternatives. And I think that's where the strength is in our movement as people of faith, people of goodwill, to champion the change that we want to see. And particularly to support community banking and credit unions. We've been working quite closely recently with the Pentecostal Credit Union in the UK. You may not have heard of them, but their story is rooted in the Windrush generation of Black Christians who came to the UK and found that they couldn't access traditional finance and credit for themselves or for the churches that they started. And so they started the Pentecostal Credit Union, which is really thriving today. And that story of Black Christians, Black majority churches leading the way in ethical finance is a story that I think deserves to be heard more widely. And I'm certainly learning as I go more on this journey to thinking about banking and ethics that there are other parts of the world, particularly in the Caribbean, where community banking and credit unions is how everybody banks. And actually that's a really good thing to look to because we can get very stuck in just thinking this is the way things are. But if we look to other parts of the world, there's lots of hopeful stories to see. I think I'm going to stop there and I think I'm handing back to Tony, who's going to introduce Bridget to hear a very practical story of banking for the common good.
Well, Rosie, I'm very grateful to you for the contribution you've made. I do greatly appreciate the concern you've put into providing us with those, thoughts from your own experience. I think that does add a great deal to the discussion we hope to be having this evening. A couple of points do cross my mind, and maybe you'd like to take before I ask Bridget to come in, as we've plenty of time to do this. You mentioned the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, and yes, I think that's a very interesting movement. But it's not well represented in these offshore Western European islands. There are, I think, 4 members of GABV resident in Britain. 2 in particular come to mind. One is Triodos. The second one is the Ecology Building Society, whose AGM I attended on Saturday of last weekend. And then I think there's a Charity Bank and there's a Unity Bank. South of the border that divides Ireland into 2 parts, I can find nothing that has the same. The Bank of Ireland, the Allied Irish Bank, and the one or two, a smaller bank, the Permanent Trustee Savings Bank, are more or less all we have. And it does make it very difficult for anyone who lives in that part of Ireland and who wishes to bank with a more, be a customer of a bank that does things for the times we're living in. Where do they do it? One of the meetings I held some years ago, Dublin, I think, we did in fact have a speaker come from Triodos Bank, and she made a very good case for the work and outlook of Triodos, and to the point I think where one of the participants from the assembled company said something like, "Having heard what you've said, I would like to put my money in Triodos." And she had to say, "I don't think we can do that because you're not resident with no local branch, with no local head office in Ireland. And that was around 2008, 2009, I think, and the situation remains the same. So there's more to be done, I think, in Ireland. Before we move on, Rosie, would you like to respond in any way to what I've just said about emphasising those banks which are run with some kind of principles?
Yes, Tony, I think you've given some good examples. We've been doing some work in our work, certainly for churches, to identify where they could move their money to.
Yeah.
And those banks, they do exist. I think they're sometimes just barriers because they don't provide the same services as some of the big high street banks. But so there's some, I think there's work, there's a movement that needs to happen to make that, well, we need more options, don't we? And we need more options that are suitable for what we need. For individuals, I think it can be fairly easy to identify where you can move your money to. For churches and institutions, I think it is slightly harder. But many of the big NGOs here in the UK who currently bank with the big banks are starting to have conversations about what they could do to support fair and more sustainable banking and where they could move their money to. So I think a shift is happening, but it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? We need the options to be able to move to, but if the options are not there, then we need to campaign for legislative, we need to make sure that they can grow and those new banks can flourish. So there's lots of different tactics I think that we need to use if those options are not available to us where we are.
Something I often say is you can't ask for something you don't know about. And if you really believe banking is embedded in a sort of worst possible way of doing things, then you can't even think of considering the possibility that there may be something like honest banking. I've had some problems in my own experience in trying to convince people that there are honest banks. And that's why I think I was keen to hear from you that you meant the names I mentioned, but it's a very small market in terms of banks and banking. And we need to maybe, I know we've asked you to do something next week, and I hope maybe we could return to that idea of how to bring some consciousness to people about what the banking can be altered in some way, and set your aspirations for you who gives you the financial services you need. Set your aspirations a bit higher than what lies down the main street in the town in which you live.
Tony, sorry, there are a couple of questions also in the chat, Rosie. Would you like to address them? Can you see them, Rosie, the questions?
Yeah, I can. Do you want me to take those now?
I think it's
we still got plenty of time, and I'm not trying to exclude Bridget, but I want to give her a chance to make the case. So maybe we'll be brief about it, and then we'll see after Bridget's time if we've any time left. We can certainly give some time to mutual banking.
Yeah. So there's a question around financing of mining for minerals and the green transition. Yeah, I mean, that's not something that's my area of expertise. I know there are organisations that work on that more closely, and we could perhaps share some links afterwards. I think the green transition, a just sustainable transition, there's going to be lots of things coming our way that we need to be attentive to, because there are plenty of sectors that will want to be part of the green transition, but that we might say are not part of that solution. And so I think it's something that we will need to educate ourselves around. How we engage with Chinese banks and companies is obviously really challenging. I don't know that there's much that we can do, but maybe through investor and shareholder action. But yeah, it's a great question. It's really good to be, I think, attentive to those things that don't get so much focus and that aren't making the news headlines. If I can think of anything to share in terms of a link to point you towards, I'll pop that in the chat later.
Right, thank you. Does anyone else? Rosie and I have done most of the talking. I'm sure maybe one or two other people might like to contribute something. Most people are muted, but you can unmute yourself, I'm told. If not, I think we'll move on and ask Bridget to tell us about mutual banking as an alternative strand of thinking about what could be. Bridget, I see you're looking as though you'd like to get started, so please do it. We'll come back to these things in the chat before we close this evening.
Okay, hey, thanks for inviting me to this event tonight. And I'm here representing the Northern Mutual, which is a campaign that we've set up here to help us establish a mutual bank in the north of Ireland. So I'm going to give a presentation. I'll go through some slides, so I'll just share that now. And can people see that?
Yes.
Okay, okay. So I'm gonna... So one of the things, just picking up on a couple of things Rosie had said, you know, about trying to change the current financial system, I think there's definitely a need to change the current system, but even to go a step further to replace it, because I'm not that sure that the institutions that we have now in the finance sector are really fit for purpose or really interested in doing what's right or doing what's right for the common good. So we're really, a mutual bank is a stepping stone to replacing the current system, which is really toxic. And it's mutual banks are quite common outside of Britain, outside of Ireland, but here, as Tony was explaining, there are big banks that dominate in Britain, and there are big banks that dominate in Ireland, and they're, apart from credit unions, which are not banks, they're just savings and loans institutions, there isn't really an alternative to that high street bank. And the mutual model is something that we're trying to promote because it is a genuine alternative to that. The kind of values too that a mutual bank has, and I'll go into that when, you know, later in the presentation, they would address a lot of the problems that have been raised here by Tony and Rosie. But I'll get started with the presentation anyway. So I'll just kind of start with defining what a mutual regional bank is. So a mutual bank is one that's owned by its members, so it's not owned by shareholders. Shareholders are there to make profit. And so this model is different in that respect. And because it's owned by its members, it's accountable to those members. So it's not serving the needs of shareholders. When you're a customer in a bank, you're not really the focus or the priority for the bank. It's the shareholder that is. So there's a conflict of interest there, really. So the bank will do what's good for its shareholders and not necessarily what's best for its customers. We want the bank to be regional as well, and that means that it would be able to operate in the region that it's designated to operate in. So when you get a banking license, for the mutual, that banking license would just serve the north of Ireland and the north of Ireland only. And that means that that whole thing where you were talking about banks investing outside of the region, investing in all sorts of extractive and fossil fuel industries, that wouldn't really be able to happen in the mutual model, because it would have to reinvest all its deposits, all its money back into the region. Because it's regional, then it means that it's only the people who live here or that are connected to here that would be able to become members. And the whole thing allows money to be recycled back into the local economy and to local communities. And it allows the bank to prioritize the needs of local businesses and co-ops and the needs of the local economy, the needs of local people, and the needs of the environment. The idea too would be for a mutual bank, and especially the one we're trying to set up, that it would be ethical. So that means that it would be purpose driven, not profit driven. Its purpose would be prioritizing what's best for people here, what's best for the environment, and it wouldn't have excessive salaries or bonuses like the high street banks have. And while it would obviously have to make enough money to be able to pay its bills, to pay its way, it is not driven by that. It's not driven by making profit. Another important aspect is that the mutual bank would be inclusive. So no one who lives here or is connected to here would be refused a bank account. So when Rosie alluded to people who can't have access to banking services, there's actually quite a lot of people who don't even have bank accounts. And maybe that's by choice, but a lot of the time that's because they're refused a bank account for whatever reason. And in this case, the mutual bank would not do that. So people would have access to that very basic need of a bank account. And we do see as well the high street banks losing more and more branches and ATMs, and they tell us that's because nobody wants these things. That's not actually true. People do want access to cash. They want access to branches. They want to be able to speak to somebody if they have financial difficulties or they have a financial decision to make. So these services are definitely needed, and especially in rural areas, but because banks are trying to make profits, they have to focus on what's costly, and having a branch is costly. We don't have that profit motive, which means that we don't need to gather in all the money we earn and just to give to shareholders. But there are also the model that we propose using. There's a mix of hybrid remote branches that they don't have to be all in person, that they can use technology so that they could be set up in local community centres or local venues that don't require a whole building to be rented out or owned by the bank itself. So you can lower costs in different ways based on the technology that we would have available. So that's kind of like some of the values about mutual banking and some of what mutual banking is about. And I've got a diagram that I'm going to show you next and go through that to kind of demonstrate to demonstrate what happens with money in high street banks at the minute. So if you've got your high street bank, it does lend to people and it does lend to businesses. And people, they may earn money, they may work in, or they may own businesses, but most of us have bank accounts and we deposit our money in those banks. And businesses, likewise, any money they generate is deposited in the high street bank as well. And as I said, the high street bank can exclude people from having bank accounts and having these banking services. So you can see people maybe who are in lower incomes, who have poor credit histories. The grade unbanked is kind of a term that's used. They're excluded from these banking services. And then all these deposits that go in, and there's a fair amount of them, from our own personal deposits, from our businesses deposits, from deposits that come from public sector bodies or universities, the health trusts. They all have money, they all have bank accounts, and at the minute they have no option but to bank with high street banks. And what happens is these banks, while they do lend some money out to people and businesses here, they actually invest most of their money outside our region. And that can be then invested in industries that maybe we don't want to have the money invested in, but it also means that the good of that, the benefit of those investments do not reach us here. So it's our money, but it's not actually being used for our good. The way that the mutual would be different, it would be an alternative to that. And so it would sort of change the dynamic of what happens to money. because it is regional and it cannot operate outside the region that it's designated to operate in, that means that all the deposits that come from people, come from businesses, has to be reinvested back into the region. So this is a way to retain the wealth and recycle the wealth that's generated in a region. So like with the high street banks, the people in the region, when they earn their money or they have money, they'll deposit it in, say, the mutual bank. And then that is loaned back out to businesses here. So we're really focusing on the social enterprises, the small, medium enterprises, the micro businesses that are here. That would include farmers as well, and cooperatives. So all of those different types of businesses that are largely poorly served at the minute by the high street banks, they would be a focus for the mutual bank, and lending could go to them, investment could go to them for startups and for overdrafts or any kind of investment that they need. Those businesses then being prioritized, they in turn, they may have social value or an environmental value for the region. They could also use local resources to meet local needs. So we would like to focus on certain types of businesses that do have a purpose, do have social and environmental value, given the need to address climate change and given the need to provide decent jobs here for people. Some of the examples of the kind of things that the mutual bank could invest in could be renewable energies. It could be in land for sustainable farming, making better use of green urban spaces so that people in cities could start to develop urban gardens and start to grow some of their own food. Maybe we could, using the money from the mutual bank, also invest in a Green New Deal for this region, and to develop community wealth building, which is a model for retaining wealth in a region and using it for the benefit of people in that region. And those kinds of, by investing in those kinds of businesses, it means we could begin to maybe generate our own energy. We have been seeing in the last few months all the problems with the energy prices. It's probably not going to really get any better. But we have people in greater fuel poverty than ever. We also have people in a lot of food poverty. And waste management, how that is handled here is pretty appalling. If they don't just bury waste in a hole in the ground somewhere, they're just sending it off to other countries to be burned in incinerators. And really, we can do a lot better. Somebody mentioned in the chat about the circular economy. If we had a mutual bank that was able to invest here, we could invest in the circular economy, reducing that kind of waste and the way it's handled at the minute. So all of these things could maybe would be better for the region in terms of making us more resilient. To be better for the planet, obviously, because we would be able to move towards carbon neutrality. It would be better for our economy, making it more sustainable, having more cooperatives, more worker-owned initiatives and enterprises, which obviously will create better jobs for people and better working conditions for people. And this has all given us a better future with more hope. Not that the bank can do all of this on its own, but certainly the bank gives us access to money that we already have, and that we, in some ways, we actually, we can start to make all these other things happen because we've got access to funds that we currently don't have access to. So just talk a bit about the campaign over and above the values and the kind of model. Is something like this viable? Is it possible to have a bank like this? We were talking earlier about alternatives and people being offered alternatives, that there are alternatives there. In most other countries, these kind of banks do exist, but they don't exist here, and they can exist here. there is there's no legal impediment to doing that. You just basically need enough money to get started. And we have a model that we can use that would take us through the whole Bank of England licensing process. We have access to suppliers of the financial technology and everything that's needed in that technical side, all the software that's needed. So I suppose the nuts and bolts are there. And that means that there's really, outside of that, there's nothing to stop us from making this happen. Our campaign is just part of several campaigns that are happening over in Britain. So there's a growing mutual banking network there where they're using the same model that we have and other models, and they are moving towards setting up mutual banks in their own regions. I think in total there's about 19 regions in Britain. Wales is a region on its own. Scotland has divided into 2 regions, and the rest of the regions then are made up of parts of England. The model that we're using would provide its members with a full service bank. So it's everything that you would expect from a bank on the high street. So it's got current accounts that accrue interest, overdraft facilities, secured and unsecured loans, mortgages, business accounts as well, business overdrafts. So everything that you would expect from a bank. The idea too is that we would provide a mix of physical and digital channels. We would have a branch network, and I had said before that these would be staffed and automated. So there's technology that we have access to that would allow us to have automated branches where it's like a very large ATM in a kind of enclosed area where you could go and do any of the things you could do at your bank. And if you needed to talk to a member of staff, you would have a digital channel like this, similar to a Zoom setup that would allow you to talk to somebody. So that having an automated branch like that really would reduce costs and would allow you to have a lot more branches and a lot more reach in areas that are currently very underserviced by banks. We also will have the fintech, the financial technology to be able to offer internet banking and mobile banking, because I think that's pretty much the norm now, and those can be very handy, and they really do complement a branch network, so that you have access to the bank and real people if you need that, but then you just have the services as well electronically if you need them. We have done a business case, a very high level business case, and we did a small amount of number crunching just to see, was it financially viable to set up a bank in a region of this size. So given that we have a population of about 1.8 million here in the north, there's about 130,000 SMEs, and there's a personal loan market of just over £1.5 billion. From that, we would aim to have a 6% market share of current accounts and a 5% market share of SME lending, and that would be enough to make this bank viable. So that's not a huge amount. I think that's totally within the grasp of this initiative, and that, I suppose that gives us the kind of encouragement we need as well to keep going with it. Just to say then, the campaign that we've been involved in, just to kind of just give you a summary of what we've achieved so far. We've registered with the Financial Conduct Authority as a cooperative society, so that's up to allow us to conduct the campaign. We've established a board from that. We've also established an advisory committee, which is an informal group made up of a whole range of the sectors, such as the public sector, local and central government, community and voluntary sector. We also have had support from some of the local councils. So we've had motions passed in 2 of the councils in support of the campaign, and other councils have been looking at it as well. We've talked to the most of them, and I think we can probably get a few more of them over the line. As I said, we developed a business case, and that shows some early financial estimates and definitely shows us that this is viable. Last year, during the assembly elections, we conducted an MLA pledge campaign, and at the end of that, we had managed to get support from 20% of the elected MLAs. That was cross-party support. We're also on Twitter at Northern Mutual, and we have a website that is about to be launched in the next few weeks. So that's the web address. Maybe Tatiana can circulate that to everybody, and it will be just, I suppose, watch the space for it, but because it will be ready very soon. And that is really me. I'll stop sharing. And I don't know if anybody's got questions, but happy to continue the discussion and answer any questions that you might have.
You are still sharing your screen.
No, it's
Yeah.
actually
It's not my
Richard?
screen.
Richard the screen. It's actually Richard the screen. Richard Clark, you are sharing your screen.
Right. Well, thank you, Bridget. That was certainly a a very careful account of what you're heading into, and I'm pleased to see you've made such progress with it. And as you say, I think these things have been done, as people used to say when I first came to live in Northern Ireland, they've been done in the mainland. I don't like that phrase, and most people don't either. But
I don't. I'm on the mainland.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you're on Rathlin Island, you might refer to the rest of Ireland as the mainland.
No, I'm on my mainland. I'm in Ireland.
Just one comment and another thing. Ask a question. My one comment is the word mutual. Building societies were always mutual, which meant, among other things, you had a right to attend the AGM, you had a right to place motions before the board, you appointed the board through a process which is entirely based upon votes of the AGM. And that was it. You were a member of the society. That relationship does not exist if you happen to be a customer of Barclays Bank. You're not a member of Barclays Bank, you're a customer. Any questions, any comments, any suggestions from anyone else? Please unmute yourself if you have something to say.
Martin Tiller wanted to ask a question, please.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks. I was just, Tony sort of made the point, really. I was just going to ask about, I think about 25 years ago, there was a big trend of building societies demutualizing, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask Bridget whether this is really putting that in reverse.
The idea of mutual banking. Well, I think, of course, problem always, I think, in these things, greed crept in. These societies were holding vast reserves, and it became very tempting to vote for their demutualization because you get a slice of the cake, part of the reserves, and it happened. And then within 2 or 3 years, they'd completely ruined themselves by the way they conducted their affairs. But yes, that doesn't mean mutuality is a bad thing. I know I was a director for some years, excuse me, of the Ecology Building Society, and we had our AGM. I was long since past time since I was a director, but nevertheless we had the AGM. We gathered in Manchester, and it was just brilliant what they've achieved in the time. Founded 40 years ago, and they're now really working with others in connection with the climate change issues. It's not just about banking and finance, it's about supporting work to alleviate the consequences of climate change. Now, I shouldn't say any more from that because I really would like to encourage some comments. We've got a list of questions here, which I'll look through when we've finished and certainly try to respond by either by email in the next 7 days or by in time for the next meeting we have a week today.
Carl, we see your hand up.
Sorry.
Anybody?
Hi, my name's Carl Gallagher. I'd just like to ask a few comments on what I've heard in the past hour. And there is a common theme here, and that is finance and the community.
Mhm.
Banking, and how the communities are probably the servants of the bank rather than the runners of the bank or owners of the bank, hence the great initiative of the Northern Mutual. We've done a lot of work in Europe and the UK throughout how we can utilize the banking system for the benefit of communities and for the benefit and the ownership in the communities, as opposed to the benefit of the ownership of the government or the ownership by the owners of banks. How do we get community ownership to benefit financially for renewable energy, for the benefit of the communities? And we've done a lot of research on this, and it's now come to pass that the vehicle that we're going to use, and we're using it with and for and against the banking system for the benefit of communities. And the vehicle we use is a thing called capital markets, which are part of the stock markets, be it New York, Frankfurt, London, etc. How can we use share prices and all of those things, all those very fancy terminologies that generally the man in the street, lady in the street can't get to grips with? So we use a thing called securitization. And how we use a thing called securitization is a method of raising funds from stock markets and capital markets on behalf of bill payers, whether you've got a mortgage or whether you've got a credit card. And what we're doing now is we're using it on behalf, that mechanism, on behalf of the electricity.
You're breaking up a bit, Carl. I don't know why.
Sorry? Sorry?
I was saying you're breaking up a bit. Your voice is what you're saying is breaking up a bit. It's not you that's breaking.
Let me see. Maybe I did break up a while back. I have no idea. Let me see if I can turn volume up. Sorry.
I'm hearing it quite clearly.
Continue, Carl. We could hear you.
Okay. Sorry about the voice. Are you recording me anyway?
We are recording you. Yes. You better watch what you're saying.
Well, I would suggest you play it back louder then. Excuse me.
Where are you based, Carl? Where are you working from?
I'm based in Northern Ireland.
Are you?
And this is a UK-wide initiative. It's a European-wide initiative, and it will spread. It's planned to spread into the United States and other places. We're already with 9 African countries and Brazil and Bangladesh. So whenever you pay your electricity bill, for how much ever that is, monthly or annually, the securities markets will lend at very low interest rate renewable energy communities vast sums of money, and we're talking hundreds of millions here. The figure is approximately 1 month's worth of electricity bills. So that is throughout Ireland, UK, Europe, or the world. The financial markets will lend at about 3%. For renewable energy development, which is owned by the communities, so that the communities own the electricity generation. It will eventually cut the electricity bills by upwards of 40%. And we have test sites throughout different countries, which proves a point. It proves a financial point, with money going into communities' own personal bank accounts. And I have to say that I'm delighted to hear of the mutual bank in the initiation of that program. I think that every bill payer will be a shareholder in electricity generation, as is what is happening right now. We will have about 200,000 bill payers before the end of this year. And the total that we will have within 2024 is 1.25 million bill payers who, through the bill paying capacity they have, they turn over 3 billion euros stroke pounds. And I would, in listening to every one of you, and Tony, you were talking absolute sense, and everybody I've heard talking brilliantly about our chosen subject. And this is a community, our community chosen subject. I would like, and we're planning through the European community and the UK to make this a proposition for every bill payer to bill through a bill, provide their or pay their bills. It doesn't matter who your retailer is or who the electricity company you're paying or whatever, or who the generator is or who the grid is, but paying through a common European aggregated and amalgamated payment system. This releases huge funding back into communities. Sorry, let me just finish one thing.
If you could, because we've 5 minutes left and maybe other people.
I can finish right now.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your contribution. If you'd like to send something to me by email, we can make use of it probably next week. I hope you'll join us next week, because we'll be exploring some of the things you mentioned here. And I just want to with a few minutes to offer to anyone else who wants to make a comment. Otherwise, please use the means of communication that I suggested at the start of this evening's event. And Case, I think, has raised his hand. So Case, what do you want to say?
Well, I just wanted to say that in the chat, I put an observation that, of course, this is not just about the banks, but this is about changing the dominant economic system, the dominant economic model, away from unlimited growth, which ecologically is an impossibility anyway, and away from measuring it in GDP, and towards an economy of simplicity and sufficiency, circular economy. So it is part of a larger sort of discussion, of course. The banking system should be changed, but the economic model should also be changed that is hanging over it. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere.
Thy point is well taken, yeah. But it would, if you say, take a lot longer than the hour and a half we've set ourselves, but it's worth bearing in mind, because unless we do that, I think the present economic system is certainly a threat to peace, however you interpret the word peace, whether in terms of the one I suggested, social justice, integrity of creation, and peace in the sense of peace with each other, peace with other nations, between nations. But we might have to consider how we best do that. Economic illiteracy, a term I use purely descriptively, I think is a very prevalent aspect within our population. I think we're almost at the end. I should like to close by thanking Rosie for her very eloquent presentation. We have heard a great deal of possibilities and ideas this evening. We can reflect on those, and one reason we split this webinar into two sections, this one this week and one next week, is just to give people a chance to reflect upon what we've been said, and possibly next week to have a more participative engagement on these matters. We have some things planned for next week. One in particular is to pick up another aspect of finance, which is investment, But we realize, I think, there's a great deal to be said about banks and banking before we get too deeply in it. But it would be useful, and I know Tiziana will contribute something to us on those lines. So that's where I think we are. Just one final point, and it's always a final point, isn't it? I wasn't quite clear about the idea that banks are creating themselves poverty. Something that is creating poverty, and it's to do with banking, is putting up the interest rates on the weird assumption that this will cure us of the inflation we've been suffering now for the best part of a year. That story is absolute nonsense. But the central bankers in several countries, including the European Central Bank, seem to be convinced that because inflation is still with us, they just haven't tortured us enough. And that's something else to think about, economic illiteracy at very high levels. It's 8:29, and I think it's our time that we said good night to each other, wish each other peace and friendship, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Yeah.
Thanks, Connie. Good night.
Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for the thoughts and contributions you've made. And well, as I've said it already, peace be with us. All right. Good night and sleep well if you can.
So long.
Good night. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody.